Hello everyone, my name is Boulevard. Welcome to Tournament Tactician for the World Championship Qualifier 2022. Now, you haven't seen a lot of content from me lately. You're not going to see much more content from me for the remainder of the week because I have been working in the background to put on broadcasts for the World Championship Qualifier. Many of you knew that. Apparently, many of you did not know that. So on Saturday at twitch.tv/sparklingiced, we will have the EMEA qualifiers for the World Championship. Now, we are reliant on streamers for both the Americas and EMEA, so if any of you are playing, I don't care how long your delay is, if you could, find it in your heart to just go live on Twitch or talk to us and work out something on Discord, it'd be a big help. And then for the Americas on Saturday and Sunday, that is the reason that I haven't tweeted or made a Reddit post, is because I do not know if we are streaming on twitch.tv/GiantSlayerTV or twitch.tv/GiantSlayerLOR. But it will be one of those two. And once I get that figured out, if you follow me on Twitter at casterboulevard, I'll tweet out when everything is going live. I'll tweet out deck lists and all that kind of stuff. So do yourself a favor and get in on the ground floor of that resource system that I'm going to have out for you. If you don't really use Twitter, I'll probably be putting it on the competitive subreddit at the very least. It might be a day or so late. But yeah, that is what has been tying up a lot of my time, including not being able to do my usual super deep research into what the meta looks like and how all of the non-tier 1 decks pair into the tier 1 deck. Now, I've done a little bit of digging, and I don't want to put up matchup charts because originally I wanted to put here's how this deck plays into control, and here's how it plays into mid-range, which really just means Vayne, and then here's how it plays into aggro. But the aggro column really got me screwed up, because I'm like, do you mean, MF Swain, or do you mean, Red Gwen, or do you mean, discard aggro? Because they all actually have relatively nuanced charts, especially if you are considering Red Gwen aggro, which is sort of the space in the meta that it's taking up in terms of what you want to be beating with it. So it didn't really make sense to do charts, which is fine. The tier list is still here. It is well thought out, and I'm going to be going deck by deck to explain its place in the meta, what you should be expecting if you run into this in opposing lineup, everything like that, both for those of you who are still on the fence about your deck selection and playing in the World Championship, but also for those that are just going to be viewing and might want a little bit of a primer before we get into all of the actual games. So there have been a few changes to the tier list. What has changed is significant, but again, I'm going to go deck by deck. So we've loaded down the Vayne contenders. Yeah, you might see some random Vayne Rumble, Vayne Zed, Vayne Gwen, but for the most part, the two variants you're going to be seeing are Vayne, Quinn, Fiora, Piltover, and Zon, maybe just Fiora, maybe just Quinn, and then Kayn, Vayne. What you are getting out of the PNZ variant that you're not getting out of your combat trick-heavy, sort of quote-unquote cheesier decks like the Rumbles and the Gwens and all that is, one, you don't just have one singular quick attack threat, you can pass it around with the Darken Harp, which is incredibly important. The other thing is the Darken itself. I believe this one is Siratu, and Siratu is going to give you refill that you are not getting out of any other Vayne build. And why it's so important that it's Siratu and not just any other sort of random Darken is that Siratu has an attack trigger to draw you cards, right? This isn't just about sort of having an infinitely recurring value engine like Zolani. It's about actually being able to progress the game state. And even if your opponent is, just vengeancing Vaynes on site, they really need to think about how they're going to be handling that Siratu in the late game. So you really get this cool dynamic of, in the mid-range or aggressive matchups, I get to play my Darken Harp as a weapon, but in the quietest matchups, the Vengeance matchups, because that's an overlap, because they're both Shadow Isle cards, it's not really worth it to risk putting your weapon onto the unit, and better to just hang on to it for the late game and make your opponent think that you don't have it so that they feel a little bit more comfortable going for Vengeances onto your Vayne or your Quinn or what have you. Then you get to drop that Siratu on it, maybe pair it with a Cataclysm or a Tumble, because there's really not a lot of, primo tumble targets in Quinn, Fiora, Vayne. You're really just kind of doing it more for the free damage push. You're not one-shotting your opponent. You're not really setting up for anything along those lines. So if you get the tumble and, it's just chilling at 0 mana in your hand and you're like, yeah, maybe I should throw this out here, but my Vayne might die if I do. Just hang on to it. Wait for that Siratu to come out, as that is your win con in those controller matchups. And then Kayn Vayne, what you're kind of getting is a little bit more consistency. The Vayne Quinn Fiora deck does have a lot of brick potential just based on the nature of being a mid-range Demacia deck. That's kind of how they've always been. Sometimes you get your hands and everything flows great. Sometimes you just draw all the wrong cards. Because you have the ability to tutor Kayn by just playing cultists, you are getting a level of security, of consistency that you're not necessarily getting out of the Vayne Quinn Fiora. Now, I don't think there's any crazy discrepancies in the matchup charts between these two. They are still both Vayne decks, but again, it's not something that I looked into super deep. But, if you are going into the World Championship, you probably should have an idea of which Vayne variant you want to be running. But from an outside perspective, it seems to be like the versatility of the Darken Harp and its ability to take over different kinds of matchups versus the consistency of always having a threat like Kayn in play. Another sort of pillar of the meta that people are building around is Jace Heimerdinger. This was the most popular deck in the most recent week of the Aegis Esports League. Now, I don't love to use Aegis for statistics for what the meta looks like, just because their format is a little bit different than what we do based on the fact that it's, 9 decks instead of 3 and you can only repeat twice. Things are different enough that it's usually not the best sort of baseline for your tournament results, but we really don't have much else to go off of. We didn't have any big open tournament the weekend leading into the World Qualifiers. No OLS, no Maru, no nothing. So we kind of just have to take it off of Aegis and use our brains a little bit, which luckily I'm pretty good at doing. Now, Jace Heimer is sort of the standard for control at the moment. There are other good control options, but usually if players are looking to counter control decks, Jace Heimerdinger is what they're going to be looking to pick on, as it's the one most consistently going to be popping up in lineups that are not like just triple control or not as thematic. It's just one of the most solid decks in the format right now, and I wanted to do a deep dive video on it. I don't think that's happening because of time constraints leading into things, but I do want to talk about Seraphine real quick, because the only Seraphine deck that I could find within like the top 30 most popular decks on Ladder is Seraphine Victor Shadow Isle, which obviously going to compete with Jace Heimerdinger for your slot. So I wanted to sort of highlight why you would play one of these decks over the other, because they do have pretty similar charts. They're relatively beating the same things and losing to the same things. The difference here, stats-wise, is that Seraphine beats the head-to-head pretty hard, but in all of the losing matchups, Seraphine is losing harder. So what that kind of means is if you are running, let's say you want to bring triple control and you're expecting everybody else to bring triple control as well, you probably want to be on that Seraphine so that you can leave open your opponent's Jace Heimer and play that head-to-head and get that sort of free win. It was pretty significantly favored for Seraphine. But if you're expecting a more open field, if you want to go for the safe pick, Jace Heimer, absolutely the way to go. Gives you a little bit more agency in those bad matchups. And one of the things that I really like about Jace Heimer is that it's sort of a control deck with like an auto win button. And I've always liked decks with auto win buttons, as long as they don't lose if they don't hit that auto win button. And the auto win here kind of being, just like a strong Hextech handler opening play with ideally with a production surger, even 2 on backup. Like Jace Heimer just has a lot of different ways to get the game out of control very early, which is why it's such an appealing option in a rather unknown field. And don't get me wrong, like we know what we're kind of walking into here with the World Championship. It's a lot of control. It's a lot of like sort of mid-rangey stuff like Vayne, like Leona, and then like this sort of aggressive stuff, the Swains, the MF Swain rather, the Jinx decks, the Red Gwen. And that's sort of one of the things about Red Gwen, right? It's kind of walking the line. But back to the point is, you don't know what's going to be the most represented. Hard countering doesn't seem like a very viable strategy, even though we are in such a tight-knit environment. Like usually when you get into the top 32, in this case a top 64, you want to get really counter-picky, but the meta is just a little bit too open in terms of we don't have enough information on tournaments to know what people are going to be bringing. And that is the scary part, right? Last year, at the World Championship, we had several players bring triple Bandle Tree lineups, and a lot of them went 0-2. But Real Key didn't go 0-2, went I think like 5-1 or 6-1, and qualified into the top 16. Your lineup might be right, and you just might hit the wrong side of the bracket. And that is what it is. You can really play this any way you want, just as long as you understand that your lineup might have been correct, and you just ran into the wrong side of the matchups. So all you can really do is kind of minimize that risk, which I think is why you're going to see more players gravitating towards like the Kayn Vayne, the Jace Heimer, sort of the safer decks. Getting down into Varus, Varus is one of those weird like flex options that I don't expect to see too often, but I do expect to see perform pretty well. I would expect one of our 6 representatives to be playing Varus in their lineup. What you are getting out of Varus is the unending cold to deal with the Vayne type decks of the format, and then you are getting Darken to deal with the control like decks of the format. In fact, really the only selling point of Varus Auction over Varus Pantheon is Zolani. It is this recurring overwhelm threat that is very difficult for control to deal with in the mid game without blowing all of their vengeances. The problem is that like you don't really have many other threats for them to be throwing the vengeances at. It's like just Varus. No one's really vengeancing an Auction. What you're getting out of Varus Pantheon is, yeah, you don't have the recursion of the Zolani, but you're getting more access to those big tools, as well as Pantheon and Eula and all these different spell shield options that you don't quite get out of the Varus Auction. And what I think is going to sell players one way or another is actually kind of how you feel about the Saga Seeker nerf, because you do have to play it differently. Like, Saga Seeker's still, like, fine into control. You can't just, like, throw it down turn 1 and expect it not to get thermo beamed, because there's not a lot else to thermo beam in that matchup. As well as, you know, you don't want to open it up to, like, Vile Feast. The last thing you want to do is be like, okay, yeah, you know, I'm playing it like I've got a Pale Cascade, and then your opponent calls your bluff and you don't have it, and your Saga Seeker just drops, right? So, again, there's a lot of preference, personal preference, that's going to come into this World Championship, which I think is pretty cool, a lot of expressiveness. But essentially, just Varus is good because Control bad versus Darken, Vayne bad versus Frostbite, and Varus gives you access to all of that. Now, Elusives and Ephemerals kind of fit into this same category for me, where these are not bad decks by any stretch of the imagination. These are actually pretty good decks. You'll notice that Tier 1 and Tier 2, pretty cold, not a lot of things in there, but they're pretty low agency. Now, Ephemeral suffers from this a lot more. It is a very low agency deck, but because of its general strategy, you're doing very well into control, and you can still overrun things like Vayne. You're doing pretty poor into aggro, but you are going to have to sit down and make a meta call. What do you think is not showing up? And me personally, I don't think aggro is showing up. Annie Jin was one of the worst performing decks in... Actually, no, sorry. It was the worst performing deck by a wide margin during the most recent week of the Aegis Esports League. It went 1-9 across the games that it was played. And there's not really, you know, part of it is the Decimate discourse. In fact, one thing that I want to show you here real quick is this is Runeterra AR. It's a website that you should all be familiar with. If we go to the meta and we go down to Annie Jin and we look for the best deck, the one that pops up first, it's actually a Conservatory Riptide Rex list, right? Like, this is not, and then if you check out the other players' lists, then we get back into more traditional Decimate Annie Jin. Oh, look, it's Burn Annie Jin. And again, oh, look, it is Burn Annie Jin. So the fact that Circuit has the highest win rate on the deck while playing not Decimate, not Burn, it's just, you know, Conservatory Riptide Rex, oops, I fooled you all with Trifarian Assessor in here. And, like, it's a very, very weird build. And this really scares me if I am someone who, you know, likes to play aggro, if that is my walk of life. Jinx is doing very well for itself, but I think finding the other decks alongside it, unless you consider, like, Elusives and Ephemerals to be aggro decks, in which case, like, yeah, that is probably what your aggro lineup is looking like, because these very straightforward strategies are just so difficult for Control to deal with. Again, in Elusives, you have the Harazi, these Darkens, so many elusives that, like, the Spiderlings and the Chump Blockers just do not do anything against. And then on the side of Ephemerals, you just have units that don't stick around, things that feel bad to use removal on. The Shark Chariots are going to run away on your opponent pretty immediately, and just a lot of things have come together to actually make Ephemerals a rather appealing option for people who are on an anti-control style lineup. And then elusives, you know, more agency, bigger threats. You don't have to just, like, throw down a Harazi and hope for the best, your Zoes and your Teemos. You just throw a weapon onto them and they feel pretty safe. And the builds of this have been changing a little bit. I was looking at, like, Majin's list versus What Am I's list, and, you know, how many weapons they want to be playing and weapon makers. And, you know, it does kind of come down to how many Quietus are you expecting, how much control. You know, just play smart if you're going to go this route. But I do think that this is a very viable option for players to go into, as I think you have really good shots into both Vayne and control decks. Leona, kind of doing what you expect it to, right? This is sort of the other big mid-range deck of the format, but it doesn't quite lose to the Frostbite effects like Vayne does, which is why it still gets to slide in there. And you've got some cool tricks, nothing too fancy. You are still a rather straightforward Daybreak deck. You're not doing very well into things like the Elusives, randomly doing very well into Ephemerals, though. But mostly you're here to beat Vayne and not do your best versus control, and there are a few tech options that you have to get around that, but generally Leona's just going into people, the lineups of people who are not looking to ban Vayne. And then FTR has just kind of been crushing it. A lot of things that are winning into Jace Heimer are not winning into FTR, and, you know, the Frostbites get to do a little bit better against FTR than they do against Jace Heimer, but at the end of the day, Something like a Varus deck that has the Unending Cold is not killing my Trundle and Tryndamere. As long as I don't get baited into atrocitying when I don't have to atrocity, I can just kind of sit here and attack you with the Trundle and the Tryndamere every round, and you're going to have to keep using your Frostbite effects, and then eventually you're going to run out of them, and either my attack is going to go through, or you're going to be forced to use something else, and that's when the Atro comes in. So not only that, but it's got sweepers, right? And that means it's going to do very poorly against ephemerals. And that's one of the things kind of ticking up ephemerals is like, hey, you know, FTR is probably going to show up. And these avalanches and these blighted ravines, they don't do anything against sort of these ephemeral boards, and because most of your backline units have 3 HP too, so even those aren't getting wiped out in the avalanche. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of highlight that FTR is like very much on the comeback. I think it's like the number 3 deck on ladder currently. And again, you have the Frostbite effects to deal with the Vayne side of things. You have the late game assurance of the Feel the Rush. You have the Trundle in the mid game. Like, you've got the tools there. And because there's not a lot of aggro, or at least the aggro decks that we're seeing are much more board based because Decimate took those nerfs, and players are still kind of split on whether or not Decimate is something they want in their anti-Jin list. Is it a full 3 of? And without that late game assurance, aggro is just not doing as well against control as it used to, especially if you're a sweeper heavy build like FTR, because, you know, your opponent is going to want to, like, they play an attacker, you play a blocker, they go for the stagehand, and that stagehand nerf down to 2 health is what makes Avalanche a good card in those matchups again. So just wanted to highlight that FTR is, I would say, probably like gonna be a top 5 deck at the event, because its charts are just like so different from Jaceheimer's that like anti Jaceheimer lineups like are not doing what they need to do against FTR. And then tier 3 I kind of reserved for like counter picks. I don't think Anti-Jin is an unplayable list by any stretch of the imagination, and if you want to build out an aggro lineup to beat the Vaynes and the Leonas and stuff, yeah, Anti-Jin might be the route that you want to go, but it's not one that I personally recommend. Seraphine we already kind of went over. Discard is where things get a little interesting, because I want to talk about Echo Jinx as well. So Jinx Raven, you know, it's been like the number 2 deck on ladder for pretty much the entire meta. Jinx Lulu's like exists, but not really there. I don't think that discard really has the tools that it needs. I think Draven at 2 health is still way too susceptible in, you know, like this avalanche and Mystic Shot centric meta. I just think you're a little bit too reliant on the Jinx. It's not a style that I love right now. MF Swain, like, it's just on here because it probably goes into your aggro lineup. Same thing with like Red Gwen. You know, these aren't the most impressive decks in the world. Red Gwen does like very well into sort of the good decks of the format. Like, it does pretty well into Vayne, it does pretty well into Jaceheimer. And the reason it's in tier 3 is because it's not doing like insane things really versus anything else. But back to discard, I wanted to talk about Echo Jinx, because if you look at Echo Jinx, a lot of the builds that I see are just Echo Zillion from like, you know, 3-4 months ago with Echo traded out for Jinx, which makes sense to me, right? We're expecting a lot of Shadow Isle from every archetype, right? We've got mid-range Shadow Isle, we've got control Shadow Isle, we've got aggressive Shadow Isle, and all of them are running Quietus. And previously, Echo Zillion did very well into control, and a big part of that was that there was no efficient way to answer the Zillion. It would either level or threaten a level and then get a big removal spell or multiple removal spells out of your opponent to pave the way for your Echo, give you more time to set up, and get that big rally turn off. Echo Jinx is actually not doing very well into control, which surprised me, because I was like, okay, yeah, we took out our Quietus target, because, you know, they can just Quietus it now, so Zillion's not going to be the pressure point that it used to be against control. And Jinx, yeah, sometimes when you play Echo Zillion, you would just run out of cards and be sitting dead in the water, and Jinx can kind of help fix that. But Echo Jinx is actually doing pretty bad versus control for the most part. If I remember correctly, it's doing pretty well versus Jaceheimer, and I would imagine, if I'm remembering correctly, that is just a byproduct of the rocket clearing out the turrets in a lot of situations. But Echo Zillion rather, has always been a very difficult deck to play. Its ladder stats are not really indicative of its tournament performances, and so while I think Echo Jinx is pretty clearly the best Jinx deck, it's really hard to evaluate in this quick turnaround time, because it is just so similar in playstyle to what Echo Zillion was. And like, I'm not convinced that you could just trade out the Jinx for the Zillion and have a similar experience. I think that the 2 champions do pretty drastically change the way that you need to think about everything, in terms of the extra reach that you're getting from the Jinx, the extra assurance and draw power you're getting out of, and predictions that you're getting out of something like Zillion. It's not really like a 1-to-1 swap that you can just kind of 50-50 on the day of. This is something that you need to be thinking about pretty hard, but its stats don't impress, and because all I have to go off of is the stats, that's really all I can give you. But a lot of people got caught off guard by Echo Zillion, and I would love for nobody to get caught off guard by Echo Jinx in the same regard when it comes to their World Championship top 16 qualification. And that's really all I can kind of say on the deck. It is what it is. Ziggs to Leah. Let me not skip over Conservatory, because Conservatory has been coming back. This deck has been doing okay on ladder, and when it was good on ladder, it was never, like, great in tournament, and I don't really expect that to change, and the Americas always kind of hated it. Like, none of these cards have been nerfed, or buffed, rather, from when the deck was, like, full power, right? When we were just TF Annie, and Conservatory only had a countdown of 10. You know, Katarina's a little bit better now. The Riptide Rex, I think, is what's just really doing it, is the fact that, like, the control decks are not killing you fast enough. You will get an opportunity to drop a Riptide Rex on them. And because control is more prevalent than it was the last time TF Annie was a good deck, that's kind of why it's been able to pop up into the meta. And in fact, we're getting a lot of tastes of older metas, because again, like, Ziggs to Leah is popping up as a good deck because control is popping up as a good deck. Now, this time around, it is just Ziggs to Leah. Previously, it was like Ziggs to Leah and Sundisk and something else was like your perfect Shurima anti-control sort of lineup. The problem is that with Aftershock now being tied into, like, Piltover Tellstones, and, you know, Crumble being 4 mana, Shadow Isle Tellstone being, like, a pretty okay card in a lot of these decks, it's just a little bit too easy to remove landmarks right now. So Sundisk is still sitting in the gutter, but Ziggs to Leah is performing very admirably despite the nerfs to Ancient Hourglass. So if you're looking for a third deck for, like, these anti-Jace-Heimer or, like, anti-FTR lineups, like, I think Ziggs to Leah is doing some really impressive things right now, and absolutely don't sleep on that. Nora Vygar, nothing crazy to say about this one. It's just kind of like the backup Jace-Heimer. Like, if you have Jace-Heimer in your lineup and you want to go control, like, you're probably Jace-Heimer, FTR, and Nora Vygar is, like, just kind of the weak link of that deck, or of that lineup, rather. Just sort of like baseline, right? Like, I think Jace-Heimer and FTR are very powerful decks, and then, like, Nora Vygar is not as powerful as them, but, like, the strategy is consistent enough that, like, you still have your Quietuses and your Vengeances. You're still going to beat the things that control is looking to beat, right? But Nora Heimer, pretty much not on the table, because you do want that Jace-Heimer in your lineup if you are going to go for the triple Shadow Isle control option. And then Deep, sort of the last deck to bring up here, doing very well into Shadow Isle. You know, these decks are not killing you quickly. There's a lot of time for Maokai to do what Maokai needs to do, and you get to play the board pretty early with your Sea Scarabs, you know, your 2/1s, you got a lot of lifesteal in the deck and stuff right now. Like, Deep is just a pretty well-positioned anti-deck. Probably awful into Vayne. Probably awful into Leona as well. You know, things that are actually able to, like, put pressure on them and not let them get that Maokai level up off. But also things that aren't just folding because I threw down a 3/2 lifesteal unit, you know what I mean? So Deep, definitely something to keep on the radar. I haven't seen any, like, Lee Sin decks performing crazy. I haven't seen any other Seraphine decks that are going wild. So this just kind of is where everything is right now, at least as far as I can tell from, like, the stats. Obviously, I only have access to, like, ladder stats and tournament stats. I don't have access to, like, the scrim stats the players have been going through. And I do think that there are a lot of deck building adaptations that you can make to really swing some matchups right now that I think are really cool. But I do not have enough time between now and the World Championship to, like, get into all of them with you. And that is part of the part of your skill expression as a player, right? Is, like, finding out those minute changes that you can do to swing matchups in your favor. And it was just something that I wanted to highlight, is, like, I think there's a lot of room for experimentation in the meta still, even though it does seem rather set in stone in terms of, like, what we have here. You know, just your mid-range control aggro sort of standard, with control I think being the more powerful of all of the options. Like, if I were going in this weekend, as I mentioned, I don't think aggro is really going to show up. I don't really want to be beating the Vayne. I'll go ahead and ban the Vayne and play against everything else. And I would definitely be on, like, Jace-Heimer, FTR, and then for my third deck, I would probably be on Ziggs to Leah. You know, just give me a little bit more of a hedge into those control matchups. I think that Ziggs to Leah is going to do fine into the other mid-range matchups. Now, I haven't put too much thought into that, but that is definitely, like, the starting point that I would be on. So if you're still, like, completely lost right now, that's the lineup that I would, like, give a go. Yeah, it looks a little bit weird. Maybe the stats don't completely homogenize in the way that you want to, but that's kind of where lineup intuition is coming into it more and more for me these days. And I like the mid-range decks. You know, I think that, like, Varus Elusive Ephemeral is, like, a perfectly defensible lineup. There's just not really the decks that I've played right now. I've played mostly Leona and Jace-Heimer this format, and I've been really liking the Jace-Heimer, and, you know, the FTR slots in nicely, and I think, like, Ziggs to Leah is just a deck that it might catch people in a way that they don't really expect. So that would be my lineup, but thank you so much for watching. that is really all I have for you for the tier list. Again, be sure to check out my Twitter at casterboulevard to find out when and where we are going live for the World Championship qualifier broadcasts. And good luck to all of the competitors this weekend and to all of the spectators. I will see you there on these Twitch channels. I probably won't be in chat, but I'll see you on camera and all that. So thank you everybody for your understanding as like my content kind of drips out while I get all of these things in order. And I hope that you all sincerely enjoy the show that we put on for you this weekend. A lot of hours have gone into this, both for myself and others. So it's going to be good. It's going to be good.